The letter was folded so many times that the creases had gone soft and pale, like old scar tissue, and it smelled of cedar wood and something that Abigail Vaughn could only describe as longing. She had not meant to find it. That was the truth she would carry with her for the rest of her days, the way a person carries a smooth river stone in their pocket, not because it is heavy, but because it is real and warm and something to press their thumb against when the world becomes too wide and too loud. She had not been snooping. She had simply been doing what any sensible woman might do when asked to deliver a parcel to the home of Paul Watkins, rancher of some considerable reputation in the sprawling, sun-bleached county of Beaumont, Texas, in the summer of 1878. She had been leaving the parcel on his front porch because no one had answered her knock, and the parcel was growing heavy in her arms. And when she set it down, she had noticed the loose board at the edge of the porch railing, and under the loose board, wedged there as if placed deliberately or perhaps just caught by the wind, was a single folded envelope with no name on the outside and no stamp, because it had never been sent. It would be fair to say that Abigail Vaughn was not the kind of woman who read other people's correspondence. She was 26 years old, the daughter of a schoolteacher who had died 2 winters past, and she had been raised with a bone-deep respect for privacy and for the written word. She had lived her whole life in the town of Beaumont, had attended the little church on the main road every Sunday until the roof caved in from a hailstorm the previous April, had taught reading to the Mexican children whose parents worked the ranches for wages that barely covered their boots. She was not a meddler. She was not a busybody. She was simply a woman who had found a letter, who had hesitated for precisely the amount of time it takes for a thunderstorm to roll in off the Gulf, and then, because the sky was darkening in a way she had seen too many times not to recognize, she had opened it. The first line undid her completely. I have started this letter 17 times and I cannot seem to find the beginning, which I suppose is because the beginning was so long ago that I have forgotten what ordinary life felt like before you were part of it. She stood on Paul Watkins's porch with the sky turning the color of a bruise above her, and she read the whole thing through twice. It was not a short letter. It was 4 pages of careful, deliberate handwriting, the kind that a man produces when he has taken considerable care with his words, when he has crossed out whole paragraphs and started again on clean sheets of paper. It spoke of a woman named Abigail. It spoke of watching her cross the street in front of the general store in the pale February light, and thinking that the world had no right to be so beautiful. It spoke of the way she read to the children on the schoolhouse steps, and how her voice carried on the warm air like something that had always belonged there. It spoke of a man's considerable terror, which was the word Paul Watkins had used, terror, and of how he had held this terror close for 2 years and had found himself unable to put it down, and how he had written this letter one sleepless night in March and had then, when morning came, been completely unable to send it because a man like him, a man with rough hands and a small ranch and a past that had not always been gentle, had no right to put such words in front of a woman like Abigail Vaughn. The letter ended with 8 words that she read 3 times and then pressed against her chest as though she could warm them there. I think I have loved you since February. The first fat drops of rain hit the porch boards around her feet. She looked up at the sky. She looked at the letter. She looked at the long dirt road that led back into town and at the winding path that circled around to Paul Watkins's barn and back door. She folded the letter carefully, put it back in its envelope, put the envelope in the pocket of her skirt, and she stood very still for one long moment while the rain began in earnest. Then she knocked on the door again. Paul Watkins had been born in Missouri in 1845, which made him 33 years old in the summer of 1878, old enough to have seen considerable portions of American history that he would have preferred not to witness. He had been too young to serve in the early years of the war, but old enough by the end, and he did not discuss what he had seen during those years, because there was nothing useful in the discussing of it. He had come to Texas in 1868 with $40, a horse named Bertram who had since gone peacefully to his reward, and a determination to grow something from nothing that had been so fierce it had kept him warm through 2 bleak winters in a one-room shack that barely kept the wind out. By 1878, he had a proper house. It was not a grand house. 3 rooms, a porch that wrapped around 2 sides, a stone fireplace he had built himself from creek rock, a well that produced sweet clean water, and a barn that held 6 horses and 40 head of cattle. He had a man named Domingo who helped him with the cattle, Domingo being a compact, weathered Tejano of 50 or so years who had worked the land around Beaumont since before most of the Anglo settlers had arrived, and who possessed a directness of character that Paul respected enormously. He had a garden where he grew more than he ate, and he brought the surplus into town on Saturdays and gave it to whoever needed it, because he had been hungry himself and saw no reason to hold food above anyone's dignity. He was not, as far as the town of Beaumont was concerned, a complicated man. He was reliable and fair and quiet. He fixed what was broken. He paid his debts. He did not drink to excess, and he did not start fights, and he did not involve himself in the uglier forms of frontier justice that still circulated through certain corners of the county like bad water through a cracked pipe. He had stood up 3 years prior, when a group of men had decided that the Tejano families in the south part of the county needed to be reminded of their place, and he had stood up quietly and with considerable personal risk, and the matter had eventually resolved itself. And Domingo had never spoken of it directly, but had one day arrived at the ranch with a horse Paul had never seen before, and said simply that the horse was Paul's now, and that was the end of the conversation. What Paul Watkins was, privately and in the deep, unwitnessed hours of the night, was a man of considerable feeling who had made himself very small on the inside in order to fit inside the ordinary shape of his life. He read. He had more books than most people in Beaumont thought a rancher ought to need, and he read them by lamplight after the day's work was finished. He thought about things. He thought about the nature of loneliness, which was not the simple absence of people but something more textured and specific than that, like a room you have furnished for someone who has never arrived. He thought about Abigail Vaughn with a frequency that might have alarmed him if he had been the kind of man who alarmed easily. He had noticed her first in February, just as he had written in the letter. He had been coming out of the hardware store with a length of chain, and she had been crossing the street with a stack of books balanced in her arms, and the pale winter light had been doing something extraordinary to the color of her hair, which was the deep, warm brown of creek water running over copper stones. She had been wearing a blue dress and she had been talking to herself. He would learn later that she always talked quietly to herself when she was concentrating on keeping something balanced, and she had looked up and seen him and nodded and said good morning as though it were the most natural thing in the world, and he had said good morning back, and that had been the whole of their first exchange. But he had gone home and thought about it for 3 days, which told him everything he needed to know about the state of his heart. They had spoken perhaps a dozen times in the 2 years since. Brief conversations at the general store, or at the Saturday market, or once at the edge of a revival meeting that neither of them had attended very enthusiastically. She was easy to talk to in a way that made him acutely aware of how rarely he found conversation easy. She was intelligent and she was curious, and she said what she thought without apology. And she had a laugh that she did not deploy often, but that, when it came, was so genuine and unguarded that it made the whole surrounding world seem briefly more honest. He had written the letter in March, on a night when a norther had blown through and the wind had been shouting at the walls of his house, and he had been sitting by the fire with a glass of untouched whiskey and the accumulated weight of 2 years of unspoken feeling pressing on his chest until he could not sit still. He had written it all out. He had read it over in the morning light and had felt simultaneously better and worse, the way a wound feels when you have finally cleaned it properly. He had folded it and put it in his vest pocket, and had carried it there for a week with some vague notion of delivering it. And then the week had passed, and the notion had not improved in practicality. And eventually he had put the letter under the loose board on his porch where it had rested, unopened and unseen, for 3 months. He had been in the barn when Abigail Vaughn arrived at his door the first time, her wagon carrying the parcel that Ed Hutchins at the general store had asked her to deliver since she was heading out that way anyway. He had not heard her knock. He had been talking to the horses in the low, unhurried way he had learned settled them after a thunder-nervous afternoon, because the storm had been visible for hours before it arrived, and the horses had been feeling it in the air. He had come back to the house when the rain started in earnest, crossing the yard at a jog with his hat pulled down and his coat catching the wind, and he had been reaching for the door handle when he heard the knock from the other side and had stopped cold. He opened the door. Abigail Vaughn was standing on his porch in the rain. Her hair had come partly loose from its pins and was plastered against her neck, and her cheeks were flushed from the cold and the wet, and she was holding an envelope in both hands and looking at him with an expression he could not immediately name. It was not anger, though there was something fierce in it. It was not embarrassment, though her chin was lifted in the way people lift their chins when they are fighting embarrassment off. It was not quite what he would have called courage, though it required considerable courage. He would understand later. For a woman to cross 3 miles of open country in a building rainstorm and knock on a man's door holding the private contents of his heart. "You left something on your porch," she said. He looked at the envelope. He felt the blood go from his face and then return to it in a rush that he was fairly certain she could see. "Miss Vaughn," he said. "Paul," she said, which was the first time she had used his given name, and it sounded entirely different than he had imagined, which was to say it sounded real. "I can explain," he started, though he had no clear idea how that sentence was going to finish. "You said you think you loved me since February," she said. Her voice was steady. The rain was not. It was coming down the way Texas rain comes down when it has made up its mind, in curtains and sheets that made the yard invisible beyond the first 5 feet. "February of last year or the February before that?" He stared at her. "The February before that," he said, because it was the truth and he had apparently lost the ability to be strategic. 2 years. She looked at him for a long moment. The rain roared on the porch roof. A thread of water ran down the side of her face from her hairline and she did not wipe it away. 2 years, she repeated, not accusation, something more like wonder. "I know," he said. "I know how that sounds." "Do you?" she said. "Because what it sounds like to me is that for 2 years I have been walking around this town thinking you were perfectly indifferent to my existence, which has been its own particular kind of—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "Can I come in out of the rain, please?" He stepped back from the door so fast he nearly knocked the lamp off the side table. "Of course," he said. "I'm sorry. Yes, please come in." She stepped through the door and he closed it behind her, and the sudden muffled quality of the rain inside the house was like stepping from one world into another, smaller, warmer world where the ordinary rules of things were not necessarily in effect. She stood in his front room and looked around at the books on the shelves and the stone fireplace with the banked coals that he had been adding to all afternoon against the storm's coming, and the table with the 2 chairs set opposite each other, and the single lamp that filled the room with warm, unsteady light. "You have more books than I expected," she said. "People keep saying that," he said. She turned to look at him and he realized with a start that she was still holding the letter. His letter. The one he had written at 2 in the morning in March with the wind howling, and his chest full of everything he could not say in daylight. She was holding it the way you hold something precious or something important with both hands and with attention. "I wasn't going to read it," she said. "I want you to know that. The wind had gotten under the board and it was halfway falling out and I picked it up to put it back and then she exhaled. The first line. "I know," he said. "You should have sent it." The words landed in the room between them with a quiet that felt larger than the storm outside. He looked at her. She was rain-soaked and flushed, and her hair was coming down around her shoulders in the way it never did in town, where it was always pinned and composed and proper, and she was standing in his front room telling him he should have sent the letter, and he could not for the life of him remember why he had not. "I was afraid," he said. It cost him something to say it, but less than he had expected. "Of what?" she said. "Of what you would say. Of—" He stopped, tried again. "I am not a man who comes recommended, Miss Vaughn. I don't have a great deal to offer, and I have not always been. The history that a man carries from a war is not always—" He stopped again. He was doing very badly at this. "Paul," she said, and again his name in her mouth was a different thing than he knew how to account for. "I have read the whole letter, twice. I know what you have in you to say because you said it, all of it. And I am standing in your house in a rainstorm because I read it and I came here, and I think you can probably work out what that means." He stood very still. "What does it mean?" he said, because he needed to hear it. Because after 2 years of silence and the careful management of hope, he needed her to say it out loud in the real air, where it could not be taken back. She set the letter down on his table. She crossed the room until she was standing close enough that he could have counted the rain drops on her lashes if he had been capable of that kind of attention, which he was not, because he was entirely occupied with the fact of her nearness and the way she was looking at him. "It means," she said, "that I have spent the last 2 years thinking you were polite and nothing more, and that if I had found this letter 1 week after you wrote it instead of 3 months later, 2 years of considerable and entirely unnecessary suffering might have been avoided, for both of us." "For both of us," he repeated. "I am not indifferent to you," she said. "I want to be very clear about that. I have never been indifferent to you. I thought the indifference was on your side." He reached out and took her hand, which was cold from the rain, and held it in both of his. He felt her fingers tighten around his. "It was not," he said. "No," she said. "I can see that now." Outside, the rain came down in torrents, and the thunder moved through the hills like something large and deliberate. And inside Paul Watkins's 3-room house with the stone fireplace and the shelves of books, 2 people who had spent 2 years standing on opposite sides of the same silence looked at each other, and let the silence finally end. He brought her a dry towel and a quilt from the chest at the foot of his bed, and she wrapped the quilt around her shoulders while her dress dried by the fire, and he made coffee on the small cast iron stove, because that was what a person did when they needed something to do with their hands. She sat in one of the chairs at the table, and he sat in the other, and the fire crackled, and the rain talked against the roof, and they talked for 3 hours. They talked the way people talk when they have been waiting without knowing they were waiting, not carefully, not with the social performances that governed conversation in town, but openly, and with the honest bewilderment of people discovering that someone else has been carrying the same weight they thought they carried alone. She told him about her mother's death, and about the years of teaching, and about the particular loneliness of being a woman in a frontier town, who could not be described as seeking a husband without it immediately becoming the only thing people knew about her. He told her about Missouri and about the war, not the violent particulars but the emotional ones, the way it had changed the inside of him, and about the years of building the ranch and the satisfaction that came from physical work when the inside of you was unsettled, and about the books, and about Domingo, and about the February morning with the pale light and the copper-brown hair. "The copper-brown hair," she repeated, and he could hear that she was pleased, though she was trying not to show it entirely. "Your hair is very particular in winter light," he said. "Nobody has ever said that to me before. I find that difficult to believe." She laughed. It was the laugh he had heard 3 times in 2 years at sufficient distance to make him wish he were closer, and now he was close, across a small table with a lamp between them and the quilt around her shoulders, and the laugh was even better than he had been able to reconstruct from memory. It was unguarded and real, and it moved through him the way good music moves through a room. "I should go," she said eventually, and then neither of them moved. "The rain hasn't stopped," he observed. "No," she agreed. "It hasn't. They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the rain. "Tell me what you were afraid of," she said. "The real version, not the polished version." He looked at his coffee cup. He looked at the fire. He looked at her. "I was afraid that what I feel was larger than what was appropriate," he said. "That if I said it out loud, sent the letter, you would look at me and think that a man who feels things that strongly after that short an acquaintance is a man with a problem. That you would step back from me rather than toward me." She was quiet for a moment. "That is not an unreasonable thing to be afraid of," she said. "It's also wrong in this particular case, but I understand why you were afraid of it." "What were you afraid of?" he said. "When you were standing on the porch with the letter." She thought about that. The fire popped and shifted. "I was afraid that it wasn't about me," she said. "That there was another Abigail, or that you had written it about someone in the past and I had just read my own hope into it." She paused. "I was also afraid that you would open the door and be angry that I had read it." "I should have been," he said. "You weren't." "No," he said. "I wasn't. I was," he searched for the word, "relieved." Which I realize doesn't make logical sense, since being found out is not generally a relief. "Unless you were hoping to be found out," she said. He thought about the letter under the loose board. He thought about how he had placed it there rather than burning it, which would have been the prudent thing. He thought about the way hope operates in a man who will not permit himself to hope too directly, finding side doors and back routes and small unsent letters placed under loose boards. "Perhaps," he said. The rain finally stopped around 10 o'clock. The world outside smelled of wet earth and the particular richness of Texas soil after summer rain, a smell that Abigail had always loved, and that she associated, after that night, with the feeling of a life rearranging itself into a shape that made more sense. He hitched the horse to the small buggy and drove her back to town, which was a courtesy, and also, she understood, a way of extending the evening by another hour. They rode through the washed clean dark with the wet grass shining on either side of the road and the stars coming out one by one as the last of the storm moved east. "I would like to call on you," he said at her door. "Formally, if that would be agreeable." She looked at him for a moment, sitting up on the buggy seat with his hat in his hands and the moonlight catching the angles of his face. And she thought that she had sat across a table from this man for 3 hours and learned more about the inside of him than she had learned about most people in 26 years of living beside them, and that the letter folded in her pocket was 4 pages of the most honest thing she had ever read, and that she had walked 3 miles in a building rainstorm to knock on his door. Which probably said all there was to say about her own position on the matter. "I think," she said, "that we are perhaps past the formality of calling." He smiled. It was not a smile she had seen on him before in the brief public exchanges of the preceding 2 years. Those had been polite smiles, measured smiles, the smiles of a man keeping careful watch over the temperature of his own expression. This was a different kind of smile entirely. It was warm and a little wondering, like a man looking at something he had not expected to be given. "Then I will see you Saturday," he said. "You will see me Saturday," she agreed. She went inside. She stood in the dark of her small front room and pressed her back against the door, and held the letter against her heart, and stood there smiling for a considerable time. Saturday came, and then another Saturday, and then a succession of days that were not Saturdays but that contained Paul Watkins in them regardless, because once a thing has been put into motion it has its own momentum, and the thing between them had been accumulating momentum quietly for 2 years before either of them had admitted to it, which meant that by the time it was finally admitted, it moved with considerable speed. He came to town on Tuesdays and Thursdays as well as Saturdays. He brought her things from the garden: early corn, summer squash, the dark sweet tomatoes that he grew from seeds he had been tending for 5 years. She brought him books from the small collection she had inherited from her mother, books that she thought would suit him, and she was right about which ones more often than not, because she had been paying attention to him for 2 years the way you pay attention to someone whose attention you would like to return. They walked together in the evenings when the heat broke and the air came off the gulf smelling of salt and distance. They talked about everything, and the talking never grew thin or habitual, because they were both people who had been doing their best thinking alone for a long time and who found, now that they had someone to think alongside, that the thinking went to new places. Domingo observed the change in Paul with the particular equanimity of a man who has spent 50 years watching the world arrange and rearrange itself. He said nothing for 2 weeks, and then one morning when Paul came in from the upper pasture singing quietly to himself, Domingo looked up from the fence post he was setting and said, "Bueno," and went back to work, and that was the whole of his commentary on the matter, which Paul found entirely sufficient. The town of Beaumont had more commentary. It was a small town in the frontier sense, which meant that it was actually several communities overlapping the Anglo ranchers and merchants who had come in the wave of settlement after the war, the Tejano families who had been there for generations before any of them, and who occupied a position in the social and legal geography of the county that was technically equal but practically was not, and the smaller communities of freedmen who had come after emancipation and were building something permanent with the careful determination of people who had learned not to trust the permanence of anything and were building it anyway. Abigail had taught children from all 3 communities, which put her in a complicated position with certain portions of the Anglo establishment, who found her teaching choices eccentric at best and suspect at worst. She did not find Paul's position complicated. He was, as far as she could tell, a man who judged the world by the simple standard of whether a person was honest and whether they did harm, and who applied this standard without reference to parentage or origin or the color of a person's skin, which in 1878 in southeast Texas was not a position that everyone shared and that required a certain kind of backbone to maintain. She told him this one afternoon when they were sitting on his porch watching the sunset turn the sky over the gulf into something that no painter would have believed if you described it to them. "You're not complicated in the way I expected a man with this much." She gestured at the ranch, the land, the general solidity of what he had built. "Weight," she settled on. "With this much weight to protect to be. I had a man in my regiment," he said. He did not talk often about the war, but when he did she listened without interrupting, because she understood it cost him something. A black soldier in the last months. He had more decency in him than any other man I encountered in those years, on any side. He was killed by men who were technically on the same side as him, which, he stopped. His jaw tightened and then released. "I decided a long time ago that I was not going to spend my life arranging the world into boxes that had that kind of cruelty built into their walls." She reached over and put her hand on his arm. He covered her hand with his. They sat like that while the sunset finished its extraordinary business and the first stars appeared, and the cicadas began their enormous sound, and the Gulf wind came up warm and salt-scented off the flat southern horizon. In late August he asked her to marry him. He did it very plainly, without theater, standing in the garden at dusk with his hands still dirty from the day's work and the last of the sunlight making everything gold and ordinary and completely perfect. He said that he understood he had already made his feelings plain and that she had made hers plain in return, and that he was not a man who saw the benefit of extended delay when a thing was clear, and that the thing seemed clear to him, and he wanted to know if it was clear to her. She said yes before he had quite finished the sentence. He looked at her. "You didn't let me finish. You were going to say, 'Will you marry me?'" she said. "The answer is yes. I was going to say several other things first. Were any of them going to change the answer?" He thought about that. "No," he admitted. "Then yes," she said. "Yes." He had a ring that had belonged to his mother, a small gold band set with a garnet that was the color of dark cherries. He had carried it from Missouri when he came west because he had not been able to leave it behind, even though he had not at that time had any particular plan for it, because some things you carry without knowing why and understand later. He put it on her finger there in the garden with the dirt on his hands and the smell of tomato plants around them, and it fit as though it had been made for her, which he took to be a sign of something, being not generally a man who placed stock in signs, but willing to make an exception when the sign was this clear. They were married in October. In what remained of the little church on the main road, the congregation had been using it since spring despite the caved-in portion of the roof, having covered the gap with timber and canvas in a manner that was architecturally questionable but practically functional. The preacher was a man named Reverend Alcott who had a voice like a church organ and a deeply charitable view of human beings, including those who had not always made the church their first priority, which described both Paul and Abigail to varying degrees. Domingo came to the wedding. The children Abigail had taught came to the wedding, most of them with their parents, making the small church a more interesting demographic cross-section than Reverend Alcott's regular Sunday congregation, a fact that Reverend Alcott appeared to find delightful rather than troubling. Ed Hutchins from the general store came, and Mary Hutchins, and the widow Peterson from down the road, and a few of Paul's neighboring ranchers who had worked alongside him through droughts and cattle troubles, and had formed the particular bond that comes from shared adversity. The portion of the town that did not come, and there were some, the people who had opinions about Abigail's teaching methods and Paul's social arrangements, was not missed in the room. The room was full of warmth and the smell of autumn, and the particular joy of two communities of people who had not always been allowed to occupy the same spaces, sharing a celebration without ceremony about the fact of it. When Reverend Alcott asked if anyone present had cause to object, there was a brief silence during which two of the smaller children giggled and were hushed by their mothers, and then the Reverend nodded with satisfaction and continued. Abigail wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself, because she had good hands with a needle, and because she saw no reason to wear white when blue was so much more becoming. She wore her hair up, with the garnet earrings that had been her mother's. Paul stood beside her in his good dark coat with his hair combed, and his face freshly shaved, and looked at her throughout the ceremony with an expression that several women in the congregation would later describe privately as the most unguarded and devoted expression they had ever seen on a man's face, including their own husbands. She moved to the ranch the following week. She brought her mother's books, which filled 3 shelves of their own on the wall across from Paul's shelves, and 2 quilts, and a small oil lamp that she had kept since childhood, and a habit of talking to herself when she was concentrating that Paul found endearing in direct proportion to how much it would have driven a different man to distraction. The ranch became, by degrees, a different place. Not because she changed it in any dramatic way, but because a home is a different thing with 2 people in it who have chosen each other on purpose, who have looked at each other clear-eyed and said yes. The kitchen was warmer. The table, which had held Paul in his solitude and his untouched whiskey glasses for 10 years, now held 2 people, and the remains of meals that were sometimes excellent and sometimes educational, and always eaten in company. The front room in the evenings had the lamp and the fire, and the sound of 2 people reading separately and occasionally aloud to each other, which was a form of intimacy Paul had not known he was capable of wanting. She continued teaching the children on the ranch's east side, because when she had married Paul it had seemed important to her that her work not disappear into the marriage, and Paul had agreed with her about this immediately, which she had appreciated. He helped her set up a proper little schoolroom in one of the outbuildings that had not been serving any other function, and they cleared it out together and whitewashed the walls and set up rough benches and a proper board, and the resulting space was not luxurious, but it was light and clean, and it smelled of whitewash and possibility, which was more than sufficient. The families came. The Tejano children who had been meeting on the porch steps in all weathers could now meet in a room with a stove. The children of freedmen families from the south part of the county, who had been making the long walk to town and back with no guarantee of welcome, now had a place 3 miles closer. Abigail taught reading and numbers and basic grammar, and she taught it to all of them in the same room with the same attention, which remained in 1878 a more radical act than she would have liked it to be. But she had ceased to be surprised by the distance between what ought to be ordinary and what required courage. Paul became the unofficial keeper and sometimes guardian of the little schoolroom's peace, which was less a matter of violence and more a matter of the occasional neighboring rancher, who arrived with opinions about who should and should not be educated alongside whom. Paul had a way of discussing these opinions with people that was very calm and very clear, and usually resulted in the person with the opinions going home having thought better of acting on them. He was not a large man, but he had a quality of absolute stillness that certain kinds of men found more persuasive than belligerence, the stillness of someone who has made up their mind. The winter of 1878 was mild, which was a mercy, because mild winters made everything easier. The cattle, the garden's overwintering plants, the work of building and maintaining a life. Paul and Abigail moved through the season in the way of two people learning the choreography of shared days, the particular rhythms of waking and working and eating and resting that a shared life requires. They were not always in perfect step. She was a person who made decisions quickly and then committed to them. He was a person who thought things through at length and then acted with certainty. She was at her best in the morning and grew quieter and more inward as the day progressed. He was slow to wake, but had his best thinking in the afternoon. She liked the doors open when the weather permitted. He had a rancher's habit of keeping everything latched against wind and weather. These were not serious difficulties. They were the ordinary texture of two specific people learning to share space, and they navigated them with the practical goodwill of people who had something larger that made the smaller frictions unimportant. In the evenings, he read to her from the books she had brought. Her mother had been a school teacher and had owned real literature, novels and poetry and natural history, things that Paul had not encountered in his own collection, which ran more to history and philosophy, and the occasional unexpectedly passionate Western novel that he claimed to have acquired by accident, and she teased him about mercilessly. She read to him from his books in return, particularly from the history, because she had her mother's gift for reading aloud in a way that made things vivid, and Paul would sit across from her with his coffee going cold and listen to her make the past sound like something still alive and relevant. She found the letter again in December. She had not moved it from her pocket when she had transferred her belongings to the ranch, and it had traveled with her dress to the wardrobe. And one cold morning, when she was looking for her heavier winter skirt, she found it in the pocket of the blue dress she had worn to the ranch that rainy August evening. She sat on the edge of the bed and read it again for the third time. Paul came in from the barn and found her sitting there with the letter. "Is that?" he started. "Yes," she said. "I found it again. I had forgotten I still had it." He stood in the doorway. Outside, the December sun was thin and pale and the yard was iron-hard with frost. "Do you want it back?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. "I wrote it for you. Even though you didn't send it." "Even though," he said. She folded it carefully and put it in the small wooden box on the nightstand where she kept her mother's earrings and the small photograph of her parents that was the only photograph she owned. Paul watched her put it there and said nothing, but she saw something in his face that was quiet and deep and satisfied, the expression of a man watching something find its right place. By spring, she was expecting their first child. She told him on a morning in April when the peach trees he had planted along the south fence were in bloom, the blossoms so dense and extravagant that they looked impossible, a kind of botanical overstatement that the Texas spring specialized in. She told him simply because she had concluded there was no useful ceremony to it, the fact being the fact, and he received it the way he received most important information, with a stillness that she had learned to read correctly, not coldness, but the quality of attention that a man gives to something he does not want to receive carelessly. Then he crossed the kitchen and held her for a long time without saying anything, and she held him back, and the peach blossoms were visible through the window over the kitchen table, pink and extravagant and briefly, perfectly present before the wind took them. He said, against her hair, "I did not expect to be this lucky." "You wrote a letter," she said. "I read it. It's not luck, it's consequences." He laughed, which was still something she collected, his real laugh, the low, warm one that she had not heard in the public version of him, and that she had come to think of as exclusively hers. "That is the most practical way anyone has ever spoken about the best thing in my life," he said. "I am a practical woman," she said. "You walked 3 miles in a rainstorm to knock on a man's door holding his own letter," he said. "That is also practical," she said. "I was resolving an uncertainty. It is not practical to leave an uncertainty unresolved for longer than necessary." "You resolved 2 years of it in one evening," he said. "Because you left the letter on the porch," she said. "You helped." Domingo was told that afternoon, and received the news in the manner of a man who has been expecting it and has already formed opinions about it. He said that the child would be born in December if the months were right, and that December children were difficult but loyal, and that the peach trees were going to need proper pruning before the heat of summer. And then he went back to what he had been doing, which was repairing the fence along the north pasture, with the efficiency of a man who understood that the practical work of the world did not pause for sentiment. The pregnancy proceeded well through the spring and into summer. Abigail continued teaching through June, and then slowed in July, when the heat became too much for anyone in southeast Texas to sustain full exertion without consequence. The schoolroom was closed for the summer months regardless, as the children were needed for farm work, and she used the time to prepare the house in the ways that a woman prepares a house when a new person is expected to inhabit it. She refinished the cradle that she had found in the barn, which Paul said had been made years ago by a carpenter in town who had made it for a couple who had subsequently moved on, leaving the cradle behind as something too bulky to carry and too good to discard. It was solid work, smooth wood, and she sanded and oiled it until it gleamed and smelled of clean wood and the cedar oil she had used on it, and set it in the corner of their bedroom where the morning light came in through the east window. Paul watched her work with the combination of pride and concern that she recognized as the particular emotional configuration of a man who cares too much to be useful. She put him to work on practical tasks: the new door for the barn that had been needed for 2 years, the reinforcement of the fence along the creek where it had been weakening since the spring floods. He was better with a clear task than with ambient worry, which she understood about him the way she had come to understand the whole of him, not from the outside but from the inside, from the accumulated deposit of months of paying attention. Late summer brought trouble of the kind that came periodically to ranching country, which was the drought kind. August was brutal, the sky a white and pitiless blank above the land, the creek reduced to a thin ribbon and then to still pools, and then to damp patches in the gravel. The cattle suffered. The garden burned despite their best efforts with the well water, though the vegetables they had already canned and stored were sufficient for the winter, and the fruit trees along the south fence had been deep-rooted enough to survive. Several ranchers in the county tried to restrict access to their remaining water sources, a thing that in drought years became a form of violence by other means, cutting off the smaller landholders and the Tejano families who had been working the land longer than anyone but whose legal claims to water were more tenuous. Paul opened the creek on his property to anyone who needed it, a decision that cost him something in terms of his own cattle's consumption, but that he made without hesitation, and Domingo worked out a rotation system that ensured the water was shared without waste, and the families who came to the creek brought what they had help with fencing, extra hands at the harvest. Skills and labor exchanged with the practicality of people who understood that survival in hard country required something more than individual effort. The drought broke in September with a week of slow, steady rain, the kind that soaked in rather than running off, replenishing the creek and the wells and the deep reserves under the dry hardpan of the pastures. The land recovered with the stubborn vitality that Paul had come to think of as the truest thing about it. He had seen this land broken by heat and flood and drought and cold, and each time it had come back, not unchanged but persistent, adding each difficulty to what it was rather than being finished by it. He thought sometimes that the land and Abigail were similar in that respect. She had buried her mother and kept working. She had spent years teaching children in circumstances that were less than ideal and against resistance, that was sometimes less than polite, and she had kept working. She had spent 2 years of not knowing, and then she had found the letter and walked 3 miles in the rain and knocked on his door. And if that was not the specific quality of persistence he admired in the land, then he did not know what to call it. He told her this one evening in September while the rain was coming down gently outside and the smell of wet earth was coming through the open door, and she was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands folded over the considerable evidence of the coming child, looking out at the yard with an expression of thoughtful satisfaction. She turned and looked at him. "You're comparing me to the land," she said. "Favorably," he said. "That is either very romantic or very peculiar," she said. "It can be both," he said. She considered this. "I will accept it," she said, "since you mean it as a compliment." "I do," he said. "I absolutely do." Their son was born on the 3rd of December, 1879, which meant that Domingo had been correct about both the month and the quality of December children, because from the first moments of his life, the boy was evidently not going to be easy, but was going to be intensely devoted to whatever and whoever he loved. They named him James, after Abigail's father who had been the school teacher, and Robert for Paul's older brother who had died at Chickamauga in 1863, and who had been the best person Paul had known in his early life, and whom he had not stopped missing. James Robert Watkins arrived in a proper December rainstorm, which Abigail would later tell him was appropriately dramatic, given the weather-related circumstances of his parents' beginning. The birth was attended by Mrs. Calderon, who was the practical choice for such matters in that part of the county, a Tejano woman of middle years who had attended more births than she had counted, and who had the serene competence of someone for whom human biology had ceased to be alarming and had become simply the ongoing work of the world. Paul spent the hours of the labor in the adjacent state of useless helpfulness that men occupy during such events, doing whatever he was asked and staying out of the way when not asked, and going out to the barn twice to talk to the horses, because the talking helped him manage the fear that was not irrational. Childbirth in 1879 was a thing that required genuine courage from the woman going through it, and he was afraid for her, and the horses were patient with his fear. When Mrs. Calderon opened the bedroom door and told him he could come in, he went in and sat beside Abigail on the bed, and looked at the small, red, furious creature she was holding and felt something break open in his chest that he recognized as love of a kind so vast and so immediate that it was almost frightening in its completeness. "He is very loud," he said. "He is perfect," Abigail said. "He is loud and perfect," Paul agreed. She looked up at him, and she was tired beyond what he had words for, and she was glowing with something that he did not have a word for either, and he took her free hand and held it against his chest where the broken open thing was still doing its overwhelming work. "James Robert," he said. "James Robert," she confirmed. Domingo came to see the baby the next morning and stood in the doorway of the bedroom looking at the sleeping child in the cradle with an expression that suggested he found the existence of this particular small person entirely satisfactory, which coming from Domingo was the warmest endorsement available. The years that followed were full ones. The ranch grew. Paul added a second barn and improved the cattle stock and began, in collaboration with Domingo and 2 of Domingo's nephews who had come to work the land, a modest breeding program for the horses that would become over time the most significant part of the ranch's income, because Paul had an eye for horses, and the horses had their own sense of which humans were worth trusting, and they trusted Paul without reservation. Abigail's school grew too. By 1882, she had 12 regular students and was teaching 2 levels, the younger children in the mornings and the older ones in the afternoons, with occasional evening sessions for the adults who wanted to improve their reading. Because literacy in 1882 in Southeast Texas remained a matter of significant practical consequence, affecting a person's ability to read contracts and understand their legal rights and navigate a world that had been constructed, in many of its formal mechanisms, to disadvantage people who could not parse its written components. She was fierce about this in a way that Paul admired with a depth that had not diminished in the years of their marriage. The fierceness was not angry. She did not teach with anger. She taught with the deep conviction of a woman who understood that a person in possession of their own literacy possessed something that could not be taken from them in the same way that land and money and status could be taken. She had seen enough taken in the course of her lifetime to be committed to the things that were, once given, permanent. A second child came in 1882, a girl they named Clara Mee, named for Paul's mother and for Abigail's grandmother on her mother's side. Clara was born in the spring, and she had Paul's stillness and Abigail's copper-brown hair, and from the time she could walk, she followed Domingo around the ranch with the purposeful focus of someone who has identified where the real work is happening and has decided to be part of it. Domingo bore this admirably. James, meanwhile, was growing into the difficult and loyal December child that had been predicted, a boy who felt everything at maximum volume, and whose devotion to his parents was absolute, and whose willingness to comply with any request he found unjust was zero. He was going to be either an extremely effective person or an extremely difficult one, and possibly both, and Abigail taught him with the same method she used with all difficult students, which was to give him large enough questions that his energy went into the questions rather than into resistance. He was also, from the age of 6, deeply interested in the horses, which delighted his father in a way that Paul tried to keep proportionate, but that was in fact enormous, the particular delight of a person discovering that the thing they love most has been inherited, that it will go on. The letter was still in the little wooden box on the nightstand. Abigail had moved the box to the ranch when they married, and it had sat in the same spot through the intervening years, accumulating the ordinary life around it. A small jar of wildflower seeds that Clara had given her one summer, a button that had been James's favorite object at 2 years old, the photograph of her parents, Paul's mother's garnet ring which she wore every day, and which at night she placed carefully in the box's interior beside the letter. Sometimes when the children were asleep and Paul was reading and the lamp was burning low and the ranch was quiet with the deep silence of country nighttime, she would open the box and read the letter again. Not because she had forgotten it, because she had not, but because it was the beginning of the story, and it seemed important to return to the beginning sometimes, to remember what the beginning had felt like and to measure from there the full distance of what had been built. The 8 words at the end, "I think I have loved you since February," still did something to the middle of her chest when she read them. She had told him this once, in the way she told him true things, plainly and without decoration. "They still do it," she said with the letter open. He looked up from his book. "Do what?" "The 8 words at the end." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There are more than 8 years of truth behind them now." "I know," she said. "That's why they still work." He put his book down and crossed the room and sat beside her on the bed and looked at the letter with her, the 4 pages of his careful, deliberate handwriting, the soft creases, the cedar and longing smell that had faded now to mostly paper and oil from the box. "I have thought many times," he said, "about what would have happened if the board hadn't been loose." "I would have delivered the parcel and gone home," she said. "And we would have gone on as we were," she said. "For how long, I don't know. Perhaps one of us would have found another way eventually." "Or perhaps not," he said. He did not say this with heaviness, just with the simple acknowledgment of how contingent a life is, how much hangs on loose boards and rainstorms and the small decisions of an ordinary afternoon. Or perhaps not, she agreed. Which is why I am grateful for the rain. I am grateful for the rain, he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Outside the night was full of summer sound, the cicadas and the Gulf wind and the distant commentary of the cattle, and somewhere down in the barn, one of the horses was moving in its stall with that particular restlessness that meant the weather was changing again. Some new system moving in off the water. "Read me something," she said. He picked up his book. He read to her in the low, steady voice that she associated with safety and home and the best of what she had built, and she listened with her eyes closed, and the lamp burned down, and the ranch went on being real and rooted and wholly theirs. The following spring brought a good season for the horses. Paul sold 3 of the bred horses to a rancher up in Gonzales who had been recommended by a friend of Domingo's, and the prices were fair, and the transactions were honest, and the money went into improvements on the eastern pasture and new roofing on the schoolhouse, because the schoolhouse roof had been showing the same ambitions toward collapse that the church had demonstrated before the hailstorm, and Abigail had made clear that she considered the schoolhouse roof a higher priority than most other things. James turned 6 that December and Abigail began teaching him formally, which James accepted with the pragmatism of a child who understands that his mother's classroom is not a place where his charm will operate as efficiently as it does in the rest of his life. He was an unexpectedly good student once he found things sufficiently interesting, which mathematics was and spelling was not, and history was absolutely, particularly the history of Texas, which was dramatic enough to satisfy even his appetite for material. Clara at 2 was already beginning the process of taking the schoolroom apart letter by letter, removing the chalk from the chalk box and posting it in locations throughout the outbuilding that Abigail subsequently discovered over the course of weeks. Paul found this funnier than was helpful. "Your daughter," Abigail told him, on the morning she discovered chalk in the water bucket. "She is curious about the world," Paul said. "She is destructive of the classroom." "In the service of curiosity," Paul said. Abigail looked at him. He was trying not to laugh. She had a set of expressions she deployed for the various occasions when he was trying not to laugh, and she used the one that communicated that she saw what he was doing and also that she was, at some depth she preferred not to admit, amused. "She is going to be an exceptional student," Abigail said. "She is going to be an exceptional something," Paul agreed. In the summer of 1884, a dry goods merchant from San Antonio named Mr. Theodore Crane arrived in Beaumont with the intention of expanding his business network into the county, and specifically with an interest in purchasing land to grow cotton on a commercial scale. He was a well-dressed man with a brisk manner and a clear understanding of profit, and his proposal to the ranching families of the county involved converting grazing land to cotton cultivation, which required, as agricultural conversion typically did in that era and that region, a supply of labor that Crane spoke about in terms that made Paul's jaw tighten the first time he sat through a county meeting where Crane was presenting his plans. The language was careful, as such language had become careful in the years since the war, but the framework was clear enough, and Paul was not the only person in the room who saw it clearly. He spoke at the meeting, plainly and without anger, laying out specifically what he understood Crane's proposal to involve in terms of labor arrangements, and who in the county would bear the cost of those arrangements in ways that had nothing to do with dollars. He was not the most powerful man in the room, but he was the most prepared one, and the meeting ended without the consensus Crane had been seeking. Crane came to the ranch the following week with a personal pitch, and Paul declined it with the same plainness with which he had spoken at the meeting, and Crane left unsatisfied and took his enterprise to a county further north where the reception was warmer, and the matter was concluded. Domingo, who had not been at the meeting and to whom Paul described it that evening without dramatization, listened and was quiet and then said, That will not be the last time that kind of thing comes here. No, Paul agreed, but it went this time. Because you stood up. We stood up, Paul said. Half the room said no. Because you said it first, Domingo said. The room needed someone to say it first. Paul did not argue with this, because Domingo was right, and Domingo knew it. And arguing would have been a form of false modesty that Domingo had no patience for. That night he told Abigail about it, and she listened without interrupting, and when he had finished she said, "I am not surprised," which was both a compliment and an acknowledgment of who he was, and he received it as both. The 5th year of their marriage was also the year that Reverend Alcott died peacefully in his sleep, at an age that nobody was quite certain of, but that was understood to be considerable. He was replaced by a younger minister from Houston who was not bad but who lacked Alcott's particular quality of seeing the congregation in front of him, rather than the congregation he had been taught to expect. And the Sunday services became slightly more structured and slightly less warmly chaotic in ways that Paul and Abigail noted and accepted as the way of things, because Reverend Alcott had been an exceptional human being, and such people do not typically recur exactly. They went to his burial on a cold January morning and afterward stood by his grave while the rest of the congregation dispersed, and Abigail put a handful of wild sage on the fresh earth because it was what was growing near the fence and she thought Alcott would have approved of the practical informality of it. "He married us well," Paul said. "He did," she said. "He was the kind of man who made the room better just by being in it." "Yes," she said. She took Paul's arm. "There are not many of those." They walked back through the cold morning together, the kind of morning that in January in southeast Texas has a particular silver quality to it, the light coming in low and slant over the flat country, turning everything ordinary into something that looked as though it had been cut out of metal. By 1886 James was 7, and Clara was 4, and the ranch was as solid as Paul had ever dared hope it might become. Not large by the standards of the great cattle empires that had risen and were already beginning their decline to the north and west, but stable and productive and honest in its operation, which was the thing Paul had wanted more than scale. Domingo's nephews, Miguel and Esteban, had become essential parts of the operation, and the small community that had formed around the ranch, the families who worked it, the children in the schoolroom, the Saturday mornings when people came from 3 miles in any direction to trade garden goods and news, was not grand in the formal sense, but was real in the way that things built with intention and maintained with care are real. Abigail began in that year to write down what she had been teaching. She had a method that had developed over the years of working with children of different languages and different starting points, a way of moving from pictures to letters to words to sentences that worked with children who had no English at home as well as it worked with children who had grown up in it. And she put it down in a series of notebooks, careful and organized, because she had the thought that someone else might use it, that the method should not be only hers. Paul read the drafts in the evenings and made the occasional comment of the kind that is useful from someone outside the subject, the comments about clarity and what a reader who did not share the writer's assumptions would need to have explained. She appreciated the comments in the measured way she appreciated all practical help, which was to say enormously and without ceremony. She dedicated the notebooks to her mother and to the children who had taught her how to teach and to Paul, who kept the roof on, which was a reference to the schoolhouse roof and to several other things, and which made him read the dedication twice and then close the notebook and look at the fire for a long moment. "That is a more accurate description of my contribution than I expected," he said. "I am a practical woman," she said. "You keep telling me that," he said. "I keep being right about it," she said. He looked at her. She was sitting across the fire from him with a new notebook open on her lap and the lamp making shadows in her hair, which had more silver in it now than copper, and the garnet ring on her hand catching the light when she moved. She was 34 years old, and she was more herself than she had been at 26, the way people become more themselves if they are given the conditions for it, and the conditions they had built here on this ranch in this county, in this particular piece of the large and complicated country, had given her the conditions for it. And he was aware in that moment, as he was regularly aware, in the accumulated intimacy of their shared years, of how specifically lucky he was, and how specifically he meant that. Not lucky in the general diffuse way people mean when they say it, but lucky in the pointed particulars of this fire, this room, this woman, this life. He picked up his book and she picked up her pen, and the fire said what fires say in the winter, which is that warmth is not a given and is all the more itself for that. And outside the ranch was quiet and dark and real. The summer of 1887 brought news from further west that filtered through in the form of letters and travelers passing through Beaumont on their way to and from the Gulf Coast. News of the long conflict between the United States Army and the Apache in the Arizona Territory that had been one of the ongoing and brutal facts of life in the Western Territories for decades. The surrender of Geronimo the previous year had been in the papers and had been the subject of considerable conversation in Beaumont, the opinions ranging from relief to triumph to something more uncomfortable and complex that Paul and Abigail and Domingo represented, which was the recognition that what had happened in the Southwest was the final chapter of a dispossession so total and conducted with such systematic violence that no amount of newspaper framing could make it look like anything other than what it was. Paul had said as much at the Saturday market one morning in the fall of 1886 when someone had made a comment celebrating the end of the Apache Wars in terms that Paul found too clean. "I am glad there is no more killing," he said. "I am not glad about how we got here." There had been a silence, and then the conversation had moved on, because that was what conversations did in 1886 with difficult truths. They moved on, but several people who had been there would remember that Paul Watkins had said it, which added itself to the reputation that Paul had in Beaumont as a man who could be relied upon to say the true thing rather than the convenient one. Domingo had heard about the comment from his nephew Miguel, who had been at the market. He had come to find Paul afterward and had said nothing directly, but had clapped him briefly on the shoulder in passing, which from Domingo was the equivalent of a formal speech. In the fall of 1887, James Watkins, who was 9 years old and had the energy of something weather-related, fell from the fence of the north pasture and broke his arm in 2 places, which was the most alarming thing that had happened on the ranch since the drought of 1880, and which produced in both his parents a level of fear that was disproportionate only in retrospect. Because in the moment all you know is the sound of the fall and the sight of your child on the ground and the distance between you and him. Paul reached him first and carried him to the house, and Mrs. Calderon was sent for, along with the doctor from town, Dr. Hayes, who was competent and brusque in the way of frontier doctors who cannot afford to make medicine theatrical, and who arrived to find James Watkins already resigned to his situation with the equanimity of a child who has assessed the available options and determined that resignation is the most powerful one. The arm healed cleanly, which Dr. Hayes attributed to good bone stock, and Paul attributed to Providence, and Abigail attributed to Mrs. Calderon's splinting, which was excellent. James wore the splint for 6 weeks with the particular dignity of someone who has acquired an interesting story at some cost and intends to get full value from the story. He told his sister Clara about it every day for a week until Clara, who was 5 and had a precise and unsentimental mind, told him that she had heard it enough times now that the story was no longer interesting and he should find a new one. James was outraged. Paul overheard this exchange from the kitchen and did not intervene, because Clara was right and James needed to know it, and the sooner siblings told each other true things the better. Christmas of 1887 was a full house. Domingo brought his sister who was visiting from San Antonio, a small fierce woman named Esperanza who had strong opinions about the food and about child-rearing and who thoroughly approved of Abigail, which Abigail appreciated. The Hutchins family came for Christmas dinner, Ed and Mary, and their 3 children who had grown up alongside the Watkins children in the easy way of children in small communities, who are not yet old enough to have learned to sort themselves by the adult categories. The table was extended with boards, and the food was more than sufficient, and the children ate in the kitchen, while the adults ate in the front room, and Paul opened the second bottle of wine, which was a luxury he permitted on the holidays, and which produced in him a warmth of expression that Abigail found particularly appealing. After the guests had gone and the children were asleep and the dishes were done, they did the dishes together always, a small domestic ritual that they had established in the first week of their marriage and maintained through every year of it. They sat by the dying fire in the front room and Abigail leaned against his shoulder, and they talked quietly about the year just finishing, the way you talk when a year is ending, taking stock without the heaviness of a formal accounting. "James's arm," she said. "James's arm," he confirmed, with the mild retrospective relief of the thing being healed and past. "Clara and the chalk," he smiled. "Clara and the chalk. The horses. Good year for the horses. The notebooks." He put his arm around her. "The notebooks," he said. "Those will last." She thought about that. The notebooks had that feeling to her, the feeling of a thing that will be used by people who do not know your name, which was a different kind of lasting than a building or a piece of land, but was not less real. Her mother's teaching would go on in them. Her own teaching would go on in them. The children she had taught would go on in the children they would teach if they became teachers, or in the children they would raise, who would know their letters and their numbers and would read their contracts and understand their rights and stand on slightly more solid ground for it. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking about what lasts," she said. And that this lasts," she said. She meant the room and the fire and the ranch and the children sleeping upstairs and the years of it. This specifically. He tightened his arm around her. "Yes," he said, "this lasts." The fire burned down and they sat in the warm dark for a while and did not need to say anything else, because there was nothing to add to a thing that had already been said completely, and some moments are entire, and this was one of them. In the spring of 1889, when James was 10 and Clara 6, the little wooden box on the nightstand had to be reorganized to accommodate the accumulation of items that a decade of family life produces. A pressed flower from Clara's first successful garden, a small stone from the creek that James had decided was special and had given to his mother with the gravity of a significant gift. A folded note in Paul's handwriting that he had slipped under her breakfast plate one morning that said simply, "I am glad for every single day." And Abigail reorganized the box on a quiet Sunday afternoon while Paul was with the horses, and the children were following Domingo around with their version of help, which was largely ornamental but which Domingo bore with patience. She took the letter out and read it again, the 4th time or the 5th. She had lost count. The creases had gone softer than ever. The cedar smell was very faint now, mostly paper and time. The handwriting was still precise and careful, every word placed with the deliberation of a man who had started 17 times and finally got it right. She read it through to the end, to the 8 words she had pressed against her chest on a rainy porch in August of 1878, 11 years prior to this Sunday afternoon. "I think I have loved you since February." She read them, for she had genuinely lost count of how many times she had read them. She felt them in her chest the same way she always had, not less, not dulled by repetition or by the comfortable ordinary closeness of 11 years of marriage. Still present and clear and specific, the way the beginning of a thing that became everything tends to remain specific. She heard the back door open and Paul's boots on the kitchen floor, the particular rhythm of his walking that she knew without having to look. He appeared in the bedroom doorway with his hat in his hand and his face colored by the spring sun and the comfortable dirt of the day's work, and she looked at him from where she sat on the edge of their bed with the letter in her hands. He looked at the letter. "Again," he said. "Again," she said. "Sit down." He sat beside her. She gave him the letter. He read it with the expression of a man reading something that was written by an earlier and more frightened version of himself, and feeling the appropriate mixture of tenderness and retrospective exasperation toward that version. "I was terrified," he said. "I know," she said. "You said so in the letter." "I keep being surprised by how well it turned out," he said. "Don't be," she said. "It turned out well because we made it turn out well, because you wrote the truth down even when you were afraid to send it, and because I read it and came to your door." "In the rain," he said. "In the rain," she agreed. He looked at her. "I would like to write you another letter," he said. "A better one, now that I know how." "You do not need to write me a letter," she said. "You have 11 years of telling me." "I have heard all of it." "Then I will tell you again," he said. "Tell me," she said. He took her hand, the hand with the garnet ring, and held it in both of his in the way he had that first night on the porch with the rain coming down and her fingers cold, and her face flushed and everything beginning. "I have loved you since February," he said. "That February and every February after it and every month that is not February. I loved you before I told you, and I have loved you every day since telling you, and I expect the trend to continue indefinitely and without interruption." She looked at him. She was 37 years old, and she was his wife, and the mother of his children, and the teacher of the children of this county, and the writer of the notebooks that would last. And she was sitting on the bed where their son had been born, and their daughter had been born, and where they had talked through years of days and nights. And the spring afternoon outside the window was laying its gold and green across the yard and down to the pasture, and the letter was in his hands, and the ring was on her finger, and everything was resolved and real. "Good," she said. He brought her hand to his lips. "Good," he said against her fingers. Outside, from somewhere down near the barn, they could hear James explaining something to Clara at considerable volume, and Clara's response, which was shorter and more conclusive, and Domingo's quiet laugh that meant he was listening without appearing to, and the horses moving in their field, and the spring making its case, as it always did, loudly and without restraint, and the whole ordinary miraculous fact of the life they had built pressing in through the open window with the warm air, smelling of grass and horses, and the particular sweetness of Texas spring, which is brief and extravagant and entirely itself, and which the two of them sat in together, hands joined, on a Sunday afternoon in 1889, not going anywhere, not needing to, having arrived. The letter went back into the box. The lid went on. Paul stood and went back to his horses, and Abigail went to find her children, and the afternoon continued being what it was, a Sunday in spring on a ranch in Beaumont County, Texas, in 1889, 11 years past the beginning, the full distance of two ordinary people's extraordinary care for each other visible in everything they had built, and every person they had shaped, and every morning they had walked into together on this piece of land that held them. And the letter in its box on the nightstand kept being what it had always been, the beginning, held safe, in the place where it belonged,